Thank you so much, Renee and Zac. That was so illuminating in terms of where our government is in terms of either e-governance, addressing the threats to good governance. And let me ask you just something about American governance and where we are technologically and modernization tech-wise of government. I was in China just last month, most recently. I am floored by how much the Chinese have progressed in terms of e-government. And this is a closed system, e-government in terms of communicating with their people. Why is our government seemingly so behind the curve in terms of technological change and staying in front of the challenges and uncertainties of our time? When I worked in government in the Obama administration, where there was an emphasis on tech, I was floored by how many times our internet and email system in the White House, or when I was overseas in an embassy, between embassies, was shut down for good amounts of time. Renee, let me start with you.
Well, I would say I know less about the procurement process and the software. I think some of it is having people with a lot of technological expertise. And how do you find, we just saw 10 hours of hearings of Mark Zuckerberg, and I participated a bit in that process as one of many experts trying to help inform. And so you do have systems where entirely independent of procurement, their understanding of technology these are not necessarily people who have backgrounds in tech. Mm-hmm. Senator Warner spoke this morning. I would say he's an outlier, and his staffers are quite exceptional and technologically sophisticated themselves, and they are also outliers. So creating a culture, as the U.S. Digital Service does, which says that we can bring in outside experts and people who have the ability to come in and work on particular problems for short engagements in a way that you're not necessarily drawing them into full-time government service, but are able to draw on their expertise to help inform, to help solve particular problems, is one way to improve the pipeline between DC and Silicon Valley.
Yeah. Zac?
I just gave what I hope was a sanguine talk, but I'm going to switch gears. I think I would agree with a great city manager that I know, Jim Keene from Palo Alto, who says that we get the governments we deserve. And yep. The government is a reflection of the community. Mm-hmm. It actually is. And so if our systems are broken or our politics aren't working, we can moan about the leadership, but I think we might be better served looking inward and saying, what's going on in our communities? What are my fellow citizens doing? How can I influence what's actually happening at the grassroots level? That's really the only way I see to truly make fundamental change. Now, I believe in leadership. When I was in Afghanistan, as well as in Mexico, I saw how critical you need leadership. You need, leaders must lead. They have to do things that are courageous. Otherwise, what's the point? And you certainly don't get good outcomes if they don't. And I think you're certainly seeing leadership in China, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
You got to have citizens hold your leaders accountable. So citizens have to know their role, and they got to step up. And then culture matters a lot. I would argue we've got very strong grassroots norms around transparency, around effectiveness, around well-functioning government, and it's going to be hard to retrench completely. I don't think it's been great work over the last generation or two in terms of a well-functioning government or a lot of technology in government. But I think we've got the ingredients, and we got to ask our leaders to lead, and we got to hold them accountable.
Both of you in your careers have been involved in the challenges faced by our government as it pertains to tech, concerning disinformation, concerning transparency. But let me ask you guys to do a little bit of strategic planning in front of the audience right here. Can you look 2, 4, 10 years ahead and anticipate problems as it pertains to either technological modernization, e-government, challenges from within the internet system that are on the horizon but not yet prominent yet? You mentioned the Zuckerberg hearings this week, so clearly disinformation is very much front and center. but what are things that we should be thinking about that are just peeking their heads a little bit above the horizon, but when your children are 5 years older than now, will be major, major problems coming down the pike. Zac, let me turn to you. And I, by the way, invite folks to line up and ask questions to our panel. Down each alley there is a mic and a speaker, so please line up there with a question if you have one.
I would agree with, I guess, Dan Rather and so many others who've said if both sides of the aisle don't start working together, we're not going to be able to get anything done. And that feels like a systemic problem and is super worrisome, because I don't think it was like that, perhaps even when you were starting your career, but certainly well before that. People used to break bread, they used to compromise, they used to talk to each other, and that has to change. I went over to Estonia, for instance. Their e-gov stuff seems real to me. They have a single ID. You have an ID from the government. It's as if your social security number actually gave you access to absolutely every service you needed and could interact with the government based on that. Everything is online. They got to build their tech from scratch, basically, about 20 years ago. But it's possible.
I think some of the work that I did in 2015 led to was around the time that we were establishing the Global Engagement Center, which was a center that USG put together in recognition of the fact that it didn't actually have a Department of the Internet type entity that was responsible for looking at digital threats, looking at ISIS propaganda, looking at Russia. And we've seen Senator Portman and others do work to ensure that it's funded. We've seen some politicking, unfortunately, as a result of partisanship between the switch from President Obama's administration into President Trump's. I think what I look at is my work actually is quite bipartisan, and during the hearing, I think Senator Graham and Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana did some of the best questioning, really, around how to think about regulation. So when Lindsey Graham is up there talking about monopoly, this is a sign that there is one thing that there is some bipartisan consensus on, and that's that the tech industry is not quite where it needs to be. So I think looking forward, I'm encouraged by, in many ways, my experiences with both sides of the aisle on this problem. I believe that they see it as a fundamentally existential problem, because one thing that, with regard to the grassroots, if you have an uninformed or disinformed citizenry, you are not going to get the government that you want. You are going to get a government that is, in fact, very much, the people who are going to get elected are the people who manage to manipulate the primaries in the best possible way. And so a lot of the stuff that I'm looking at is what's going to happen in the 2018 elections, both in terms of foreign interference and also in terms of gameability of the systems that we've built. So I think that this is one area where there is some bipartisan consensus and a possibility for moving forward and making material change.
Let me ask you guys something that particularly young people at a university like the University of Virginia are interested in, and that's careers in public service, but maybe even more so making an impact in the public domain. And I think that particularly Mr. Jefferson's University attracts students who want to go into a life of public service. And what I think is so interesting about what you guys have done is that at young ages you have made profound impacts on the public life of this country, in part and in full from the private sector. And I think that that's important, because there are so many young people who, when they say, I want to go into public service, therefore, what government job should I go into? What is your advice to young people who feel called upon to go into public service? What are the greatest opportunities for impact today? Because I think that one needs to think more broadly in that regard, not just in terms of government, but being outside influencers, being innovators from the private sector, going into the ideas industry from academia and so forth. But what's your answer to that, Renee?
I actually looked at joining Global Engagement Center as we were establishing it and thinking about, could I make the greatest impact there? And for me, it's always been a question of where can I make the greatest impact, recognizing, having 2 young children in San Francisco, candidly, is not cheap. There is really I think I would say it's probably next to impossible for me to do that on a government salary because of the amount that we have to pay in childcare, which is a whole other can of worms to talk about with regard to our government. But so when I talk to young people, I say, like, what do you feel is your greatest strength or differentiator, and how, For me, it was several years worth of careers that gave me a foundation and a prior experiences seeing how other industries worked, and then could use that to inform and say, here's how we do it over here. Here's how the tech industry thinks about this. Here's how the financial industry operates, and how can we bring some of the best practices there into government. There's great opportunities like Code for America for engineering students, where you can do a fellowship for a couple of years. U.S. Digital Service, I love. I mean, I did kind of a short-term engagement with them, but they do longer-term things as well. 18F is another example of a kind of a startup culture, but serving government. So you don't necessarily have to be in to have the greatest impact.
Yeah. No, before I hear Zac's answer to that question, I actually found innovation within government to be actually very frustrating. Yeah. And I would, whether in an overseas embassy or at the White House, would suggest this approach and that approach. And the answer I received was, well, we've never done it that way before. And that's precisely, when you're in the private sector, why it's good to at least consider it.
Yeah.
And so change is hard, especially in that institution. And I wonder if there's something almost special about the American government in terms of being resilient to the kind of change that we may need in a very fast-moving world. Zac?
So I'll make a few points. One, change is really hard in a private company too.
Yeah.
It's hard. People don't like to change. It's really hard to change workflows. I agree. It's extremely hard in government, probably harder. But I think it's really good that young people want to go into government. There was an era where the best and the brightest went into government. And I did a master's degree in public administration, and these schools were started in that era when our post offices were made of marble and gilded, and it was a big deal to be government. Now the phrase good enough for government is a pejorative.
Yeah.
It came from an era when vendors had to be so good that they were, quote, good enough for government. And we've lost the excellence in government and government service, and the best and the brightest want to go build, tech companies or work on Wall Street. And so I think if people want to go into their governments and make change, that's really positive. I also think we think about what we sometimes call for-profit philanthropy. Starting a company to go work on a really hard problem around government or on a social issue is really meaningful. And if you can actually generate a profit, which is extremely hard to do, you're just making a revenue model that's self-sustaining so that you can have longer lasting impact in that industry. You can also use your marketing budget and your solution to change norms and change workflows. So I think the innovation and the entrepreneurship from the private sector is a really positive thing for government, and that people are going to be working in and out of the public sector and the private sector, and careers are going to weave a little more than they used to, probably.
And I'll just add to that, Zac, that at Makena Capital, which is a spin-off from the Stanford Endowment, I'm spearheading the socially responsible investing and sustainable investing there along with others. And we have seen a giant uptick on the part of investors from family offices, from sovereign wealth funds, from endowments and so forth, from pensions and so forth, saying, this is a space that we want to be involved in. In fact, I would say the dissonance today is between the enthusiasm, which is like this, and the actual vehicles to move money in a way that advances both attainable social goals and profitability at the same time.
So if you have too much money, I could probably help you out with that.
Of course, yeah. That's funny.
No, but we are seeing, we're people who laughed at us 5 years ago are now saying, hey, can we put some money in? It's exciting.
Let's turn to the audience. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. In looking at the what happened in D.C. this past couple of days with Facebook and all, do you feel that our government's somewhat asleep at the wheel? They don't even understand social media, and they're the people that are looking out after us. And I totally understand your problem of trying to sell a software that unites, but when the people that are leading us do not even understand the modern generation, kids in technology, or younger people, I say kids because I'm no longer a child, no longer a kid, no longer middle-aged, they need to keep up with us or keep up with them. in order for us to move forward. And I think maybe possibly that's what's happened in China, is they have kept up.
Yeah.
They have moved forward. They do understand new technology, and they're not in the place of old technology. Can you address that a little bit?
I can make one comment. I tend to agree, actually. I talked with a lot of people who are pretty out of touch with modern tools and technology, but I don't sell at the federal level. But I can see that. I would step back and say, our governments are designed to think out generations, decades. So I hire people who've sold software to the private sector, right, called business-to-business software. And they're like, oh, we'll jam it down their throat, or we'll do an end-of-quarter deal, or something like that. It's like, no, it's not how it works. We actually designed this government to not make quick decisions. So on the one hand, the whole purpose of the government is to spend money. On the other hand, we set up this legislature so everyone can fight with each other and debate and deliberate and move slowly, so that we weren't swayed by the passions of a vocal minority or something like that. So I do think there's some institutional inertia that is actually built into the structure of the government, and it's not just that this person or that person's an idiot. I'm sure there's plenty of idiots walking around, but our government is designed to move slowly, let people work problems out, and let those problems bubble up. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think that's one of the many things that's going on.
I would add something that I had an interesting conversation with a staffer friend where I said, we do a lot of briefings. We do a lot of briefings. Why is it so hard when I say Facebook doesn't sell data for them to understand what it is I mean? Like, why is that because I think a couple of the legislators thought that would be like a great gotcha, like, you're selling our data. I'm like, that just makes you look like you don't know what Facebook does because they don't sell your data. And the response I got back was, the lobbyists that they hear from are the telecom lobbyists, are the big the big tech lobbyists, people who have a very particular perspective, but they're not really hearing. There's no startup lobbying community. There's nobody who's saying, like, this is how we feel about small tech doesn't pay for lobbyists to go and inform. So one of the things that we've been doing at Data for Democracy, and in my role in policy in particular, is can we be that? Can we be that collection of voices that says, like, here is smart regulation related to big tech. Here are things where, I've seen some bills that have come through, even in the state of California, where they're just terrifyingly unsophisticated. There was one that I was like, this is going to ban automation. You can't, like, what's your goal here? This is a disaster. Like, we gotta do something about this. Because it's just not, it doesn't, like, the nuance isn't quite there, because the people who are writing the bills aren't the people who understand how the technology works. And so it's, how can we bridge that gap? How can we do things where people like me and people who have worked in the industry for a long time are like small tech lobbyists effectively? Can we educate? Can we provide briefings? Can we establish relationships over time in the ways that the rest of the industry has done?
One thing that gives me hope, before I turn to the next question right there, is the young generation that I've seen over the last couple of months and last couple of weeks. If, for example, since the tragedy in Florida, young people who truly know the power of interdependence and interconnectivity technologically, and that it can shift the public focus, and that it can shift public policy. That gives me great hope. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, the question is how much of our taxpayer money that goes into government for programs, how much would you feel is wasted? Because no one in government will ever tell me what they feel. We give 100%, how much is really being used for what percentage for good projects?
So I think there's plenty of inefficiency, okay? There's the typical way you build a budget is say, what did we budget last year? And let's start with that and add 2% across the board. Or we need a budget cut. Let's take out 5% across the board, which would clearly be the stupidest thing you could do, because some programs have to be working better than others. So any intro to microeconomics student in his first or her first year of college would say, no, take a look at the programs, what's working better and what's working worse. That said, and I hear this all the time, and this is not what you're saying, but I hear, oh, aren't those people so stupid, or they can't do anything right, or they couldn't cut it in the private sector. Believe it or not, many government officials earn more than they would in the private sector. I have lost employees to local governments that are paying them more, which is pretty wild.
Interesting.
Maybe that's just Silicon Valley, but I doubt it. There's no line item for waste, fraud, and abuse. And so a lot of people think they can come into government, I'll just cut that out and I would do so much better. It doesn't really work like that. And I actually work with people all day, our customers, who are smart, hardworking, they care a great deal, they're accountants or lawyers or general managers. So I have a more positive view on our local governments than probably most. It's very vexing, and it's very hard to get a large group of people aligned on a shared mission, which is the purpose of a company or a government, if you will. These governments are holding companies. They have 10, 20 different businesses. They're doing the work that is really hard to do for the private sector, typically. So you're running a government, you got a police business, a fire business, an economic development and promotion business, a library business. So there's a natural set of inefficiency there that I think most people don't understand. But I see a lot of hardworking people who care a great deal and who, are working well past 3 or 5 or even 7 or 8 in the evening.
And I'm not saying that, there isn't hard work in government and everybody tries to do the right thing, but running my own business, I know right away if I've made a mistake or not, pretty soon.
Yeah.
Yet I don't have a recurring cash flow coming in that I can make the same mistake again next year.
Yep.
So what is the percentage, you think? Guess. Swag. Scientific wild ass
Percentage of inefficiency in government?
Yeah.
Oh, it's high. I mean, it's as I said, the structure of the government. It's not designed to earn a profit. That's not why we have governments.
No.
We have you have a company. You sell services or goods to raise revenue. The government raises revenue. It coerces revenue to typically give goods and services away. It'll sell you water and power, but it's a totally different business model, if you will. And the outcome can often be nebulous things like trust from the community or 200 to 500 different performance metrics. I mean, that's how you would measure the health of a government. You can't just say, is it efficient or not?
Well, that wasn't the question.
Okay.
How much do you think is being spent without any return?
Renee, do you have a
I
perspective?
don't know how to answer
Well,
that.
I mean, you're in there, but yeah, and they can't answer it either, so I don't know. We'll see. Thank you.
We're over time, but I want to take just one more question. You, sir, right there. Go ahead.
Thank you very much to both of you. Zac, I'm glad you brought up Estonia, but in terms of thinking about a country of, what do they have, 3 million people versus 330 in the United States, we can get there, but is this more of a level of trust on a local level between elected officials, people who actually run government, and citizens? And then is there some level of education, and just how do we get to that point where America doesn't have to then, quote unquote, fall behind on all of this? What are your thoughts on how do we get to Estonia, or can we in the next 5, 10?
I think her work is probably a piece of the puzzle and very important. I think, educating people, and it's a lot of grassroots stuff. I would agree with you. And Estonia has advantages that we don't have. They essentially started in 1991 or 2 or something.
Right. Yeah.
So they don't have 30 years of legacy tech ERP systems and other things that, have green screens and white screens. Their tech's probably aging out, their first generation right now. They also maybe have a smaller, more homogenous population. There's lots of things. But if we don't make these leaps, we will get left behind. It's that simple. And you're talking about China and many others. If we don't get to the next level, and not just of technology modernization, but how we think as a community and whether we want to really bind together as a country to tackle our hardest problems, then we're clearly going to just drift sideways. So I don't think I answered your question, but more like underscored the importance of it.
Absolutely.
Renee, do you want to have the last word?
No, I think that was a great answer to the question. I think as far as the last word in general, I think that a lot of times people are looking for a way to get involved and aren't really sure how to do it. I think that groups like Data for Democracy or Tech for Campaigns or some of the civic organizations that are beginning to spring up, particularly as 2018 comes nearer the elections. There are so many different ways to get involved, whether that's for a couple hours a week or depending on what particular skill sets you have. I think that there are really material ways that you can put whatever your particular skill or passion is, to work making a difference in your community or making a difference in local elections or state elections. I would definitely encourage people to look at some of the organizations. Such a great sense of camaraderie, a great sense of purpose. A lot of them, like Data for Democracy, are bipartisan, and so it's really enhanced my experience in feeling that I have a hand in my government and where my country is going, and I would encourage others to think about doing the same.
I think that's a great way to end, because while we don't lack for dilemmas and challenges in our country, there's never been more ways to get involved. And getting involved is part of the answer to a better future for our children and our children's children. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for attending today. I hope you've enjoyed it.